Hi everyone. Today we are going to talk about symbols and motifs in The Catcher in the Rye. And just a note of encouragement real quick, if you have already taken your notes, well, I looked over your notes from last week, and for your notes this week, please consider not just writing down what is on the slides. There's a lot of information that I'm sharing, and I summarize everything on the slides, but there might be some more pertinent information just in the actual lecture itself. As you guys transition to college, as you transition into workplaces where you have meetings, not everything's going to be written down. So this is a skill of listening and taking notes that we're practicing. And that's just a piece of encouragement I can give you looking over the work that you did last week. So let's get started with symbols. At its most basic form, a symbol within literature is when an author uses an object or an action that means something more than its literal meaning. We saw this a lot in The Great Gatsby with things like the green light. There are often several layers of meaning in symbols. While they are usually concealed at first and we don't see it right away, eventually it becomes a representation of concepts or traits that are important to the story or to the main character. The Catcher in the Rye, as a text, is known for overflowing with symbols. We're just going to talk about some of the main ones today, but there are quite a few. So right off the bat, we have already discussed one symbol in the title. So the idea of literally being the catcher in the rye, so being this catcher. Because Holden sees himself as the catcher of children about to fall off the cliff of adulthood, we know more about how he sees his role in society, or at least how he idealizes his role in society. We talked about this last time and about how he wants to be a protector of the innocent. So that is one of the main symbols, obviously, in the text. Another symbol we have already seen, but maybe we haven't talked about, is Allie's baseball glove. It is described as left-handed, it's smaller in size, and Allie wrote a bunch of poems in green ink all over it so that when he was standing out on the baseball field, he wouldn't get bored. We will find out later that the only person Holden has ever shown this glove to is Jane Gallagher. And because this is a symbol, it's something that's really significant to Holden. It represents Holden's love for his now dead younger brother, Allie. And it also highlights how unique and special Allie was. It's kind of weird to write a bunch of poems all over your glove. It's also kind of interesting that Allie has a fielder's glove and he doesn't have a catcher's glove. So that's just another little bit of an allusion to the title. The next symbol might be pretty obvious. It's Holden's red hunting hat. It's actually pretty hard to find anything on The Catcher in the Rye without this hat being shown somewhere. Holden purchased this hat for $1 in New York right after he left the fencing equipment on the bus. And it's a type of hat that stands out. It's red, it's kind of big, but it also covers the majority of his face. So it offers this weird combination of being anonymous while also making him stand out a little bit, because not everybody's going to just wear this in the middle of the city. It ends up representing an array of Holden's personality. It's a symbol of his uniqueness and his individuality because it stands out, but it's also a symbol of his self-consciousness. He always mentions when he chooses to wear it, and he often makes sure to not wear it if others are around. Some also say that the color here represents innocence. And I know red is usually not associated with purity or innocence, but in this book, Allie and Phoebe, Holden's younger siblings that he seeks to protect, they both have red hair. And so for this text, red can be associated with purity or innocence. I also think that he chooses this hat as a way to separate himself from others when he retreats into his own thoughts. It's like he almost hides in it to contemplate the world around him, but he can't really hide because it's a bright red hat. So it's kind of ironic. Later, as we keep reading, we're going to be introduced to the Museum of Natural History. This is another symbol. Holden talks about how he really likes the museum's displays because they're frozen and they don't change. And he actually gets really bothered that they are unchanged, but every time he comes to see them, he has changed. The museum is therefore his fantasy world. He wants to live in a museum where nothing changes and everything is simple and understandable and easy. He even wants to take the children and put them in these museum displays so that they just remain the same. This very much symbolizes his fear of an unpredictable world and unpredictable relationships. Another symbol that we'll see are the ducks in the Central Park Lagoon, and this is kind of a dual symbol because we've got the ducks and then we also have the lagoon, the lake. And when we get to this scene, you will maybe for the first time see a little bit more youth to the character of Holden. Normally he just kind of sounds like a grumpy, critical old man, even though he's only 16. But here we see some joyful willingness to encounter the mysteries of the world. Where do the birds go? So the ducks in the pond end up being a little symbolic. The ducks prove that vanishing or change is only temporary. Yes, it happens, but people come back. And Holden's terrified by the idea of change. So if the ducks vanish, if change happens, but then the ducks return every spring, maybe there's some part of change that is cyclical, that is consistent, that he can trust. It also symbolizes that life has motion and nature also has motion. And then the pond is half frozen. So this represents the stage of life that Holden is currently facing. He's half an adult and he's half a child, and he's in that in-between stage where he is not fully committed to either side. And finally, we have the symbol of the carousel and its gold ring. And at this time, I don't know if you guys have ever ridden one of these carousels. I mean, I've ridden a carousel before, but I've never rode one with a ring. And back in the day, there would be these gold rings for children to reach out off of the carousel horses to grab one of those gold rings. And for now, I just want you guys to be aware that this is a symbol. It's going to show up later in the text. And by the time we get to the end of the story, we're going to talk about what the carousel might represent. By no means are these all the symbols that are in this text, but this does include the main ones. If you find some other objects or things that you think might be symbols, feel free to add them into some of your comments. There's quite a few in this text, which is one of the reasons why I think English teachers love to teach it. Now let's talk about motifs. We've talked a little bit about them in the past, and I know motifs can kind of be confusing because they're easy to confuse with symbols. So a motif is an object or an idea that continues to show up through a literary work. And so it's something that shows up over and over and over again. So I put that example of a little piece of art where you've got this pattern of the same thing showing up over and over, because I feel like that's a visual representation of what a motif is in a literary work. So motifs and symbols are often confused, but remember that symbols are things that represent something else to help us understand an idea or a character, something deeper, whereas motifs are images, ideas, sounds, words that help us explain the central idea of a literary work. So motifs are going to lead us to the theme, whereas symbols are just going to lead us into understanding maybe a character's motivation more or the importance of something that just happened. Okay? So we're going to look at 3 motifs today. The first one we are going to consider is loneliness. I think we saw a lot of this, particularly in the first 10 chapters. Holden has a compulsion to find some sort of companionship. In fact, that seems to be the driving force of this book, but he moves from one meaningless encounter to another. And at the same time, Holden never stops to really think about how these interactions are meaningless. And he almost seeks to maintain some isolation and detachment from the world around him. It's in Holden's loneliness that we experience how he feels alienated and separated from the world. He's both hurt by being alone, but he also feels more secure when he's alone because he can control the world around him. He doesn't have to worry about anything necessarily changing since he knows himself. The next motif is relationships and intimacy. It's closely related with loneliness. It's almost like it's opposite. So, while Holden is experiencing all this loneliness, he's also trying to seek out relationships and intimacy and being close with other people. So these relationships offer Holden the chance to break out of his isolated self, but they also represent all of the things that he's very scared of. In the adult world, relationships and intimacy involve complexity and unpredictability and a potential for conflict or change, which we all know. Change is like not Holden's thing. Holden is scared of being in any real relationship with anyone because it might bring about change. He can't control it. And so every time the opportunity for good connection presents itself, he messes it up, whether on purpose or just because he's got some really poor people skills. And then he ends up being cynical and bitter, and he's, everything's horrible. But even though he kind of continues in this cycle, he still seeks out relationships and continues in this pattern, messing up and being bitter and then being alone and then trying to find relationships over and over and over again. And finally, the third motif, lying and deception. So as we know by now, Holden loves to point out what he thinks is phony or not real or not authentic. That's his thing. And what's ironic is that lying and deceiving are big parts of what makes up something that is phony. If you're lying and if you're being deceptive, you're being fake or inauthentic. So Holden's definition of phoniness relies on this self-deception. He doesn't actually admit that he also is a huge phony. He judges others for thinking that they are something they aren't or for not recognizing their own weaknesses, but he lies all the time. He's deceptive to almost everyone he interacts with in some capacity. He lies almost at random and without need, and then he repeats this over and over throughout the text. So he just refuses to acknowledge his own shortcomings, and in this lying, Holden proves that he's just as guilty of phoniness as the people that he criticizes. So it's always kind of an interesting part of this text for me because I simultaneously connect with Holden, or at least my younger self connected with Holden. But as I'm older reading this text, I also am just so annoyed with Holden because he is pointing out the hypocrites while also being highly hypocritical too. So interesting stuff. Okay, that is all I have for us today. If you have any questions for me, make sure to come to my office hours or send me a message, and I'll look forward to going over your notes later. Thanks. Bye.